think what's really at stake most of all is whether or not the president has violated the Constitution. Because, again, we have to go all the way back to the founding of our country. You know, no taxation without representation is on that license plate on everybody in the District of Columbia. And what it really is saying is the Constitution gives to the Congress, not to the president, the power to impose taxes or tariffs. The Constitution gives to the Congress, not to the president, the right to regulate foreign commerce. So the issue is, how is it that President Trump can now start to impose all of these tariffs, again, this huge increase in taxes on Americans, without the Congress?
The Constitution explicitly gives to Congress the authority to impose tariffs.
Yes.
Can Congress delegate that authority, and has it in this statute?
Right. And so the issue that is really before the court is whether or not the Congress has handed over this power that it has. It has the power to impose tariffs or duties or taxes. Did it grant that authority, hand it over to the president through the passage of this law, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act? And the decision will largely turn on one phrase in this AIPA statute, the phrase that says that the Congress delegated the authority to regulate importation or exportation. And so the issue is, can you read the word regulate to be the same thing as tax or tariff? And the argument that most people are making, that many members of Congress, that many of the business groups, and many of the others that say the answer to that question is no, Congress did not hand over the authority, point to the fact that nowhere in this AIPA statute does the word tariff or duty appear.
If the Supreme Court upholds what the president's done, then it's clear what happens. We keep charging the tariffs. What if it actually strikes it down? What is the remedy if, in fact, the court rules that these tariffs were illegal or unconstitutional?
So if the court rules that the tariffs were illegal from the get-go, then the tariffs must be refunded to those that have paid them. And if we look, to date through at least the end of August, that means about $88 to $100 billion worth of tariffs would need to be refunded to the importers that paid those tariffs in the first instance. Because if they're unlawful, then everyone is entitled to a refund with interest.
Is there a mechanism for doing that? That sounds like an enormous undertaking.
There is a mechanism, but you are correct, it is an enormous undertaking. And it basically splits out into whether or not the particular import of this particular item in this particular shipment, whether or not all of the paperwork that Customs has to do about those has closed or not.
In the end, does all of this really matter? And we've heard from the administration, they have alternatives. I mean, you know the numbers better than I do. Section 301, Section 201, Section 337. They have a lot of different routes that they can impose various regulations and tariffs under.
Yes, and again, I do think it's very clear that the president loves tariffs. And so I think if the Supreme Court strikes down these tariffs, I do think you will see the president take up a number of these other laws and try to reimpose tariffs. But for me, there would be a pretty important distinction between them. First of all, with the one exception of the statute that's called Section 122, that would allow the president to declare that there is an emergency because we are experiencing a major balance of payments problems or currency difficulties. That would allow the president to impose a 15% across-the-board tariff on goods from every country, limited to 15% and limited to 150 days in length unless the Congress renewed it. All of the rest of the authorities that the president could turn to are going to be different than what he's done.
In the normal course, we will likely get a ruling from the Supreme Court either later this year or sometime next year on this important question. At the same time, sometimes the court likes to, as it were, duck the problem. What are the routes available to the Supreme Court? Such as, for example, there's a dispute over subject matter jurisdiction. What are the chances the Supreme Court say, you know what, we don't need to decide this, we'll remand it for further proceedings?
That can happen. To me, if the Supreme Court is going to try to take a little bit of an off-ramp, a little bit of a compromise, and again, I think you've clearly seen the Chief Justice try to find, is there some compromise? I think the compromise there may be in whether or not the court rules that there is no authority to do tariffs ever under AIPA, or whether the court takes, as it's a little bit of an off-ramp, a view that AIPA permits some tariffs, but potentially, for example, not the trade deficit tariffs. I mean, the court could, in essence, say, we could read this word regulate importation to permit some tariffs, but what the president did in imposing this, worldwide tariffs as a result of the trade deficit, he cannot do because the Congress has given him this separate authority under Section 122. The one thing that I think ought to give the court real pause about interpreting this phrase regulate importation or exportation is the fact that it is well established as a matter of law that you should read a word to have the same meaning within the statute. And in our Constitution, there is a ban on putting tariffs on exports. And the phrase within AIPA is regulate importation or exportation. So what the Trump administration is asking the court to do is to read that phrase, regulate imports means tariff imports, but don't tariff exports, because that would be unconstitutional. And so they're asking the court to read that word regulate to have two entirely different meanings in the exact same phrase of the exact same statute. And that, at least to me, is a very tall order. So when I step back from it and say, how likely is it that the court is going to say, yes, Trump, you can do this? I think the answer is, I think they're going to say no. And I think they're going to say no largely because there are other statutes in which the president can impose tariffs. He doesn't need to twist and bend and torture this AIPA phrase in order to impose tariffs. And secondly, it is really hard to see how you read this one word regulate as having diametrically opposed meanings in the exact same phrase of the exact same statute. And yet that's what the Trump administration is saying that the court should be doing.
The AIPA case is foremost one of law, but it could have enormous consequences for businesses and consumers. Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers says the economic argument in favor of tariffs is hard to make.
Look, I think the tariffs are unwise economic policy. I think on net, they push up prices. On net, they take money out of the hands of consumers, which slow the economy down. And they're, in that sense, a self-inflicted supply shock that makes the Fed's job, makes everybody in the economy's job harder. So I think they are, for the most part, bad policy. I don't think we've used them successfully to get important other benefits from other countries. And so the world will be better. The United States, in particular, will be better off. Indeed, the American manufacturing sector will be better off without these tariffs.
The two magic words in the statute, extraordinary and unusual, it says, is what we need to do to declare this national emergency. That is at least largely a factual question. How extraordinary or unusual are these balance of trade deficits, which the president invoked? As an economist, how unusual are these trade deficits?
I mean, I want to be fair, David, and recognize that there have been a lot of emergencies defined over time for a lot of different purposes, not all of which would be the kind of thing that if they happened in my family, we would call an emergency. So I think we do need to pay attention to the statutes and the history as well as that, and that's what the lawyers do and what the Supreme Court will deal with. But if you ask, is the United States in some kind of unprecedentedly disastrous situation of borrowing that is related to a lack of tariffs? The answer is absolutely not. If you ask the question, according to economics, are tariffs the right response to a foreign borrowing emergency? If there was a foreign borrowing emergency, the answer is no. The right measures would involve reducing the budget deficit, increasing the country's level of savings, for example. So I think it's pretty difficult to say that there's some aspect of the economic situation that's present today that hasn't been present for most of the last 25 years that would justify the invocation of emergency.
However we got here, we certainly have a large and growing deficit and debt. One of the arguments that President Trump is making is these tariffs are helping us with that. It's bringing in revenue to reduce that debt and deficit. Just on that limited issue, is he right?
The tariffs certainly are bringing in revenue, not nearly as much as he said they would, and I don't think the forecasts the administration makes that they'll get $1 trillion of revenue over the next year or two are likely to pan out. But yes, they are bringing in revenue, but they are also having other effects. They're holding interest rates higher than they would otherwise be. They are also slowing the economy, and those things make the deficit position worse. So I'm not sure that there's an important improvement in the budget deficit as a consequence of these tariffs. And certainly if you think of the budget deficit as some kind of emergency, these tariffs would be a very odd response to that kind of emergency.